The story begins in Akiang, in the north of Honam province, a seemingly clean and well-maintained place. In one of its public places, several people were whispering among themselves with apprehension and suspicious looks. The target of such looks was a man with long, untidy hair who remained in the middle of the crowd. He had his head turned towards the ground and sat with his legs and arms crossed. As his sweat ran down his face, the man meditated and whispered words that had a unique meaning to him. During his considerations about the wind and the weather, the protagonist remained in the same position, despite the obvious discomfort of the civilians. Until he finally raised his head and the features of his scarred face became more apparent. His eyes fixed on the clear and beautiful sky that rose above all the residents of that place. So, as the breeze grew stronger and began to tear the leaves from the trees, the man realized that he had nothing left. Many years before, swords were stuck in the ground, as the god of war advanced through the world. Beside where they fell in battle, man after man fixed his bloodied weapon. Without even blinking, he destroyed everything wherever he went. He killed all enemies in his path, not caring about strength or numerical superiority. He advanced like a beast, without hesitation and without mercy. His blows were so fast and powerful that they annihilated entire armies. He was so arrogant that he even mocked the passage of time itself. Until after so much damage, he finally found opponents capable of restraining him. As he headed towards his next destination, an unusual mist began to envelop his feet. It was an icy mist that began to freeze his back. One of his challengers soon revealed his presence with a mocking and smug smile. The protagonist then glared at him with a brutal gaze, but his upcoming fate was almost inevitable. With the appearance of the 8 saints, the consequences for having defied time had finally arrived. The demon's body was paralyzed by the cold and a thick layer of ice began to isolate him from the world he had destroyed. The saints wanted to punish him according to his crimes, but given the strength he possessed, there was no one capable of stopping him. Even with everyone's unity, it was impossible to kill that damned man. Not even the magic ice freeze was able to completely neutralize his gaze of burning fury. A gaze that was returned with equal hatred by the Union of Saints. In the end, the 8 allies managed to completely imprison Dan Wuyang, the supreme divine blood demon. His crystal prison was sealed in the depths of the Dom Geogro Lake. Little by little, the light from the surface became increasingly scarce, and darkness prevailed. To pay for his crimes, he had to remain underwater for 1,000 years. However, being defeated by guys who only knew how to eat and have fun was not at all satisfactory. But Prota agreed that this was exactly what was missing for someone like him. Fortunately, no one in the new millennium knew who he was, which allowed him to walk freely among the people of the entity. He also had no one else to leave behind. Since no one is able to live for more than 1,000 years, the newly freed demon had nowhere to go or stay. He followed his path in the company of the clouds that were carried by the wind. Thus, Dan walked like a specter, haunted by the incomparable terror of his past. But 1,000 years are capable of changing anyone. And he had changed. The Dan Wuyong of that world was different, as was everything around him. Some time later, as he walked along new paths, the Prota noticed a presence. The sound of his footsteps stopped and he focused his attention on someone lying at his feet. It was a young girl who was injured and breathing with difficulty. For a few moments he remained motionless, contemplating the body of the girl who was hanging by a thread. But then his gaze filled with pity and the man approached. The child's condition was getting worse by the second and everything indicated that the little girl had been abandoned. Still, her heart kept beating. Dan checked the girl's pulse and came to the conclusion that she only had 2 hours left to live if she wasn't treated. Soon after, she opens one of her eyes with difficulty to see who had found her. At that moment, the protagonist is surprised and awakens memories of a forgotten past. He begins to see his younger self next to the poor girl, suffering in the same way. After scratching his head a little in doubt about what he should do, he finally decides to help her. So, saying that the girl was lucky, Dan transfers part of his vitality to her. Quickly, the young girl's countenance improves. And the color returns to her face, which was previously so dejected. With such help, the risks of death were ruled out. Although other treatments were needed for her to recover completely, the main one was good nutrition, something the protagonist could not offer at that moment. But the demon began to search for food in his clothes anyway. The only thing he found were 2 golden pills, which he doubted were in good condition. At best, they could cause diarrhea, while at worst they would cause death. However, if he did nothing to help her, she would die anyway. After administering the pill, Dan left the place and left the little sick girl behind, hoping that the best of the scenario would unfold. As he walked away, she opened her eyes once more to observe him, as she was unable to do anything else to show gratitude at that moment. All that was left for her was to pray that the lucky pointer would turn to her side on that cold night. When the darkness lost its predominance and the sunlight began to shine again, the trees began to reveal their leafless branches. The protagonist was leaning against one of them, sleeping with his head bowed forward. His face was serene. Despite the unpleasant situation of the previous night, the noise of someone approaching made him wake up, revealing eyes that were not at all friendly. In front of him was a large stuffed cake, which emanated a very pleasant smell. The hands that held it belonged to the poor child he had saved the day before. The girl had a radiant look, was breathing heavily, and her hair was full of leaves. Dan looked at her in surprise and asked what it was that the young woman had brought for him. She stared at him and considered the question for a few moments with a doubtful expression, but her smile quickly returned and the girl answered that it was a cupcake. However, that was not the answer the protagonist expected, because he wanted to know what that represented to him. A question like that was too complex for such a small child. So the innocent and sparkling smile was the result. Still, the man understood that she was wanting to return the favor. Her smile was extremely adorable, and her arms remained outstretched like a sincere offering. But the demon turned his back on the little girl and said he was not hungry, finding it strange that she did not feel afraid in his presence. The next day, the child came to him once again with a huge steaming cupcake. It didn't take long for him to start accepting what she brought and for them to eat together. And so 15 days passed, in which the two became so close that the man allowed her to sit on his lap. Her innocence was something strange and unknown to the demon. But it wasn't bad. When he returned to the city, everything seemed the same as the last time. The god walked among the people with a bored expression, until his attention was drawn to an unusual situation. A man was shouting insults without moderation at someone who had been caught red-handed. The protagonist then stopped to look at the commotion that was developing. While shouting that there was nothing left to steal, the man kicked a small body curled up on the ground. The other citizens watched the scene with a mixture of astonishment and indignation. What was expected, considering that the victim of those attacks was a little girl who begged for forgiveness? It was at that moment that Dan realized that all those cupcakes that the two of them ate together in the forest were stolen. But even a demon like him couldn't stand to see a child receive all those blows without defending herself. So, even though such a stance didn't match his personality, he advanced. The kick was fast and powerful, hitting the man's arm squarely. The surprise and pain that followed were so great that it was difficult to define which was the greatest. The guy screamed in terror when he saw each of his fingers completely broken. And the poor girl remained curled up on the ground, next to the cupcakes she loved so much. Then he quickly left the place, while the guy with broken fingers scratched him. Dan walked without stopping and without looking back. His steps got faster and faster, as the situation became clearer in his mind. The demon had spent 2 weeks eating what the young woman brought. And he didn't even think about how she was getting them. He just accepted and ate, while the child watched smiling. But she was stealing and getting beaten for it. The protagonist surprised himself when he realized that he didn't like that situation at all. He continued cutting through the air at an incomparable speed, without having any idea of where he was going. When he finally stopped, he had already reached the forest. So long that he ended up being very far away, but his eyes soon recognized where he was. A clear, extensive and very deep lake, surrounded by rock formations. That was the place where he had been trapped for 1,000 years. So, the demon observed the surroundings for a long time. He, known as the martial god and conqueror of the world. Had he been trapped in that abandoned place for all those years? Danny was determined to never go near that lake again. That would be the last time he would see it. When he turned to leave, he noticed the presence of a small being among the bushes. The girl had followed him all the way, and was panting with exhaustion. Her feet were still so small, but they were already completely exposed to the harshness of the world. Even so, the protagonist wondered why she was so insistent. After all, he had only helped her once. So he asked directly about what made her follow him. But before answering, she watched with insecurity. While holding the man's clothes, the girl said that she hated being alone and asked him not to leave her. The child's words touched Dan's heart, considering that he had always been alone, even before the sealing. And this feeling of loneliness had not changed after sleeping for 1,000 years. So, he finally opened up and asked the young woman's name, whose name was Wasomi. Then, the demon extended his hand, with the thought that she was the company he needed. The outstretched hand caressed the child's head affectionately, while God introduced himself. And finally he invited her to accompany him on his new journey. When it was already night and the fire crackled, Dan began to think about what he should do from that moment on. The little girl was resting on his lap, while he determined which would be the first step to give her a better life, because even if they wanted to live together, they still had nowhere to stay. Then the protagonist, with a deep look, came to the conclusion about what he should do that night. He had to build a house for the two of them. Ever since he was little, he wanted to have a house to live in. And the next morning, this dream came true. The intense heat and light of the sun made Asum wake up. When he realized what was in front of him, his eyes filled with enchantment. It was a huge and beautiful mansion, built in just a matter of hours. The girl then rubbed her eyes hard, believing it was a dream, but nothing changed. So she went to her uncle to find out more about the mysterious house. When he pointed out that the construction hadn't been there the night before, the man got a little excited, but soon said that it was already there, the little girl just hadn't noticed. And he was just renovating the place, which had been abandoned for a long time. In this way, as the martial god spoke with such determination, the child was convinced that she had some memory problem, because she was sure that her uncle wouldn't deceive her. Besides the fact that it was impossible to build a mansion of that size, suddenly, now more calm and confident, Asum could finally appreciate the beauty of the house with joy. Seeing the girl's glow, the demon was pleased that she had liked it, saying that she had tried very hard to build it. But, faced with the child's confusion, he corrects himself, saying that his effort was for the renovation. And then he thanks her for being so young and innocent. Until she heard the child's first complaint, who asked why there were no murals. She hummed around the building, saying that it was probably because it was abandoned. The next day, the murals were all there. Impeccable. And the little girl's eyes shone with excitement, while her uncle insisted that it was nothing new, even though Asum never said at any time that he doubted it. They were incredibly tall from a child's perspective. But then a sudden thought made the girl start a funny plan. She sat on the floor and sighed deeply. The man then looked at her with some concern and asked what was wrong. To which she replied that although everything was very beautiful, it seemed very empty without trees or flowers, which made the god's gaze burn with determination. A day later, a huge tree could be seen in the center of a garden, surprising the young girl and satisfying the demon. Even a small lake had been prepared. As he observed his little companion, Dan lost himself in thought. There was still a lot to be done, including the beds and all the furniture. Besides, he couldn't allow her to go hungry, so he would have to go fishing. But it wasn't so bad to keep busy. However, he was quickly pulled out of his reverie by Wazumi's voice. Although he instantly interrupted whatever she was about to say, as he already had in mind what was missing for that young lady. So, while she dangled her filthy feet sitting on a table, the uncle worked. After a while, Assam asked me what he was building. Alquidam answers that it was a bathtub. That way, the little girl could wash her body inside the house. As soon as the work was over, the kitten started trying to escape. Until the man turned around and explained that she couldn't wear the new clothes without taking a good bath. Although the girl still tried to resist, there was no way. Living dirty might not be a problem for her. But it was for him. So, Dan grabbed her by the clothes and took her to the bath. With a single deep look, all the screams stopped. The bathtub soon filled with lots of water and foam. And the man asked how the girl intended to get clean without a bath. To which she, tearfully, answered that she didn't know. A short time later, she was finally clean and looking like a decent girl. Danny then asked, what did she think of the clothes he had bought with the sale of a wild boar? And she said happily that it was the first time she had worn clothes as beautiful as those Adis had. The god was happy that they fit well, as he was afraid they wouldn't be the right size. But she reassured him saying that it would be okay, even if it didn't fit. Because hunger or cheap clothes weren't enough to make her unhappy, as long as he was by her side. Such a stance impressed the protagonist, as she spoke very well for a child. He wished he could live peacefully from that moment on. And the young lady agreed, saying it was a good idea. But all this joy would not remain intact.